Franklin Hayes used to believe that fire had a language, not one of words but of movement, of the way flames curled around steel beams, the way smoke rose with a rhythm that could warn or deceive, and the way heat whispered through walls like something alive. It spoke to him for years, during every call, every rescue, every moment when he felt closest to the heart of danger. He learned that fire could be coaxed, predicted, even outsmarted, but never entirely controlled. It was a living adversary, sometimes a furious beast, sometimes a cunning thief, and Franklin had been one of the few who understood how to read its moods. But on the day that destroyed him, its language changed. That afternoon in Houston had been mercilessly hot, the kind of heat that shimmered above concrete and made the whole city smell faintly of sun-baked metal. Franklin had just finished a training rotation with new recruits when the alarm blared. A third alarm warehouse fire on the east side, possible workers trapped inside. He had wiped the sweat from his neck, shoved aside his coffee, and headed toward the rig with the quiet, seasoned readiness of a man who had done this 1,000 times. His crew followed, 7 of them, including the youngest, David Mercer, who had only been in the department for 8 months. David had idolized Franklin from the first day of training. He'd asked too many questions, smiled too widely, moved with a perpetual bounce that Franklin pretended to find irritating but secretly admired. David reminded him of himself, back when ambition felt like a fire of its own. Within minutes, they were racing down the freeway. Sirens wailing, lights cutting through the haze, radio chatter filling the cabin. Franklin studied the thick column of black smoke twisting into the sky like some colossal serpent. Black smoke meant fuel-rich fire, oxygen-starved, possibly ready to flash if conditions snapped the wrong way. He noted the direction of the wind, the density of the plume, the time of day, everything part of the silent calculations that made him one of the best in the department. When they arrived, the warehouse was already belching flames from every seam. Heat rolled across the pavement in visible waves. Crews on site were scrambling for hose lines, pulling victims from a half-collapsed loading dock, shouting into radios with frantic urgency. A foreman with a soot-streaked face staggered toward Franklin. "There's one more inside," he gasped. "Maintenance worker. He was fixing the ventilation system. We can't find him." Franklin nodded sharply. "Where was he last seen?" "East mezzanine, top walkway, near the service lift. But the fire, it spread fast. Too fast." David looked at Franklin, waiting for the call. The rest of the team did too. Franklin felt the familiar weight of expectation settle onto his shoulders, the knowledge that whatever decision he made would carry absolute authority. "Mask up," he ordered. "We're going in." Inside the warehouse, the world transformed. Darkness, except for the infernal glow of flames crawling along girders. The air tasted of ash and melted plastic. Every step crunched over debris, broken glass, fallen insulation, warped metal. Their flashlights cut narrow beams through the smoke, illuminating staircases twisted like bones. Franklin led them through the labyrinth of storage aisles. As they advanced, he kept track of the fire's behavior with the instinct of a veteran. It was hungry, accelerating, feeding on the chemicals stacked in crates along the north wall. He could tell by the temperature spiking along his gear that something deeper in the structure was threatening to fail. They had minutes, maybe less. When they reached the mezzanine stairs, David moved ahead, eager and fearless. Franklin caught his arm. "You stay behind me," he said, firmer than usual. David nodded, but the disappointment was visible even through the mask. The upper walkway was narrow, built decades ago, the metal already groaning from the heat. Their boots clanged against the grated floor. Franklin scanned for signs of the trapped worker, movement, sound, anything. But the roar of the fire drowned out all but their own breathing. Then, faintly, they heard it, coughing. Franklin motioned sharply, and they followed the sound toward the service lift. A man lay slumped against the railing, half-conscious. Smoke swirled around him like suffocating fog. David reached him first, checking his pulse, shouting his condition through the mic. Franklin knelt beside them, helping secure the man. The walkway shook. A deep, resonant groan rippled through the structure, the kind of sound Franklin had only heard when a building was seconds from collapse. His gut tightened. "We're moving out!" he barked. They hoisted the maintenance worker between them and began retreating down the walkway, each step more hurried than the last. Flames licked up from below, drawn upward by drafts created from the broken walls. The smoke thickened, visibility shrinking to almost nothing. Something snapped behind them, metal shrieking as welds gave way. As they reached the staircase, another explosion rocked the warehouse. The chemicals. Franklin's worst fear confirmed. The blast threw him forward, knocking him onto the landing. The maintenance worker's body slid from their grip. David grabbed him, clinging despite the impact, his young muscles straining with desperation. Franklin scrambled to help, but then came the sound he would never forget. A deep, splintering crack, followed by the slow, sickening shift of steel beams under catastrophic stress. The mezzanine was failing. "Go!" Franklin shouted. "Get out! Move!" But David shook his head. "Not without him!" Flames surged upward, lighting David's silhouette in an infernal glow. For a split second, Franklin saw the boy he'd trained, the one who believed heroes never left anyone behind. And then the walkway tilted. Everything happened too fast. The railing tearing free, the floor sinking like a ship's hull, the roar of fire swallowing the world. Franklin lunged for David, fingers brushing his turnout coat, close, so close. But the metal sheared away beneath them, and the last thing Franklin saw was David pushing the unconscious worker toward him before the walkway collapsed like a dying animal. Franklin hit the stairs hard, pain exploding through his ribs. He scrambled upward, trying to reach the falling boy, but the fire surged in a monstrous blast, cutting off the path. His radio screamed warnings. Someone was shouting his name. The heat was unbearable. No human could survive beyond the flames now licking at the entire mezzanine. He made it outside somehow. He would never remember how, and the moment he stumbled into daylight, the upper level gave way in a catastrophic implosion. Metal folded inward, glass shattered outward, flames belched skyward in a plume that blotted out half the sky. They never pulled David out. At the memorial service, Franklin stood in full dress uniform, hands shaking as he held the folded flag. The boy's parents wept into each other. His crew stared at their boots, unable to meet his eyes. The department chief placed a heavy hand on Franklin's shoulder and said words meant to comfort him, but Franklin only felt hollow. He resigned a week later. He didn't fight it. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for a hearing or defend his choices. He accepted it like a man accepting a sentence. The official report called the collapse unforeseeable, but Franklin knew better. He had been the one in command. He had made the call to advance. He had brought them onto that walkway. And someone young enough to be his son had paid for that decision with his life. He told himself he had no right to wear the badge anymore. No right to step inside another firehouse. No right to be seen as anything but what he believed he'd become. A man whose instincts had failed exactly once, and once had been enough to destroy him. He packed up his apartment slowly, folding his uniform with a care that felt like ritual. He placed his helmet in a box he never opened again. He left Houston without telling most of the crew goodbye. He didn't deserve their forgiveness, so he never sought it. He drifted until he found a small, unremarkable Texas town where no one recognized him, where he could vanish behind the dull routines of ordinary life. He took whatever work he could find, stocking shelves, cleaning parking lots at sunrise. Eventually, he found himself selling lottery tickets outside corner stores, one of the last jobs that required no recent references and asked no uncomfortable questions. The pay was barely enough to manage a modest room in a rundown building with peeling paint and thin walls, but it was quiet. Quiet enough for reflection. Quiet enough for guilt. Each morning he walked along Fulton Avenue with a clipboard of tickets, nodding slightly as people passed him by. Some were polite, others dismissed him with a glance. A few laughed or whispered. "That old guy used to be a firefighter, I think. Looks homeless. Sad, ain't it? Going from saving lives to selling numbers." He heard them all. He rarely answered. At night, he cooked simple meals, washed the same 2 shirts, read the news on a cracked phone screen. And sometimes, when he lay awake staring at the ceiling, he imagined a different life. One where he had seen the signs earlier, ordered a retreat, saved the kid. In those moments, fire had a voice again. Not the roaring inferno of the warehouse, but a whisper of memory, of everything he had once been. His hands, once steady and strong, now trembled slightly when he pulled on his boots each morning. He chalked it up to age at first, but he knew the truth. It was the weight he carried, thinning him from the inside. A full year passed, then another. Seasons changed, but Franklin remained the same shadow of the man he had been. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that fire had not finished speaking to him yet. It still had one more message, one more test, one more chance waiting in the wings of fate. The day it arrived, the sky was bright and ordinary. Children played near the corner store, cars hummed along the street, and Franklin stood beneath the awning of a small market, adjusting the straps of his ticket clipboard, unaware that a column of smoke had just begun to rise on the horizon. Smoke that would soon twist his past and future together like 2 strands of the same burning thread. Smoke that would lead him to the moment he would climb again. And that moment, like the fire itself, was already growing. Franklin Hayes did not notice the rising smoke at first. What he noticed was the heat, an unnatural, shimmering wave that rolled across the sidewalk like someone had opened a furnace door somewhere nearby. It was subtle, almost imagined, the kind of sensation a man like him would recognize long before others did. Years of training had sharpened his senses in ways that never truly dulled. Even after so much time away from the firehouse, certain instincts clung to him like scars you could feel even if you couldn't see them. He looked up from the stack of lottery tickets in his hands. The sunlight glared off passing windshields, fracturing into shards of white and gold. A few families strolled lazily along Fulton Avenue, sipping cold drinks, unaware of the tiny tremor that seemed to ripple through the air. A dog barked somewhere behind him, irritated or uneasy. He couldn't tell which. Franklin blinked against the brightness, squinting toward the horizon. There, just the faintest smear against the sky, a thin gray thread. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. Most would have mistaken it for exhaust or haze or the remnants of a controlled burn out past the fields. But Franklin's pulse gave a small, involuntary jump. Even from blocks away, even from a point so small it could have been a trick of the light, he recognized it for what it was: fresh smoke. He froze. The world faded into a distant hum as everything inside him sharpened around that one image. His breath caught. For a moment, just a moment, he had the surreal sensation that time folded in on itself, pulling him backward into memories he had spent years trying to bury. The warehouse, the explosion, the young face swallowed by smoke, the voice that told him he had failed. His fingers tightened around the clipboard. He forced himself to swallow, to step back mentally from the precipice. Not every smoke trail meant catastrophe. Not every cloud was the past returning. Fires happened. They always would. And this town had a functioning local department, young, eager, equipped with the gear he himself no longer had the right to touch. He told himself all that calmly, rationally. But the instinct, old, rusted but still living, twisted inside him with a whisper. Something's wrong. The whisper grew louder when he heard the first siren. It came from 2 blocks away, echoing between the buildings like a war cry carried on wind. Another siren joined it, and then another, forming a desperate chorus that raised the hairs on Franklin's arms. He lowered the clipboard slowly. People began turning toward the noise, some shading their eyes to look down the road. Cars rolled to a stop. Conversations paused. A child tugged at his mother's shirt and asked what was happening. She shushed him gently, worry creasing her brow. The smoke thickened. It rose harder now, darker, as if pumped by something violent and expanding. Franklin felt his heartbeat increase, thudding like slow punches against his ribs. His breath had gone shallow without him noticing. After all these years, his body remembered before his mind did. He began walking without realizing he'd moved at all, just a few steps at first, then more purposeful ones. His boots slapped the pavement in a steady rhythm. The summer heat wrapped around him, but he barely registered it. His eyes locked on the growing plume, his senses picking up details most others would never catch. The rapid change in color, the turbulence in the smoke's rise, the direction of the wind pushing it westward. A structure fire, not a brush fire, not a small one, something big enough to eat through floors. The sirens got louder, closing in from multiple directions. A fire engine tore down the street, horn blaring, scattering cars aside. People stepped back instinctively as it roared past, red and white lights spinning in a frantic blur. Franklin stopped at the curb, chest rising and falling as he watched it disappear toward the source of the plume. He should have turned back. He should have walked away. He should have remembered the years he spent running from exactly this. But the thing about instincts, the deep emotional ones, was that you didn't choose them. They chose you. And something in Franklin Hayes had awakened. He took another step forward, and another. And then he was moving fast, almost jogging, ignoring the curious looks from people he passed. He dropped the clipboard near a trash bin without realizing it had slipped from his fingers, the tickets scattering like pale leaves in a sudden wind. Someone shouted after him that he dropped something, but Franklin didn't hear them. He couldn't hear anything but the sirens and the pulsing roar growing louder with every stride. When he turned onto Ashford Street, the heat hit him like a physical blow. It radiated from the burning apartment complex that dominated the end of the block. Flames licked from the shattered windows of the lower floors, spewing columns of smoke that twisted upward in violent spirals. Bright orange tongues tore through the facade like monstrous hands clawing for escape. People were screaming. Dozens of residents had spilled into the street, half-dressed, barefoot, some clutching pets or crying children. A woman collapsed on the sidewalk, coughing, while neighbors pressed wet towels to her face. A man shouted for someone named Maria. A teenager sobbed into her phone. The scene was a storm of panic and confusion, all orbiting around the inferno that was devouring the building. Franklin stopped short, breath knocked from him by the sight. 14 stories. Fire on multiple levels, smoke blowing toward the east, meaning the western fire escape was likely blocked. Flames moving upward rapidly, the chimney effect, accelerated by broken windows. One ladder truck already deployed, but he could see from here that the ladder wasn't long enough to reach the top floors. He watched as the ladder extended to its full length. It stopped at the 12th floor, too shy of the top. Firefighters yelled commands. Hose lines sprayed high arcs of water that evaporated before they even reached the target. Radio chatter filled the air, chaotic and urgent. Franklin's gaze traveled up the facade. There, on the 14th floor balcony, stood a woman clutching a small child. The little girl coughed violently, her tiny body jerking with each breath. The mother screamed down for help, but the wind carried her cries away, scattering them like broken pieces. Franklin felt the world tilt, the same feeling he'd had in the warehouse, the same helplessness that had carved into him like a brand. Only this time, something else punched through the fear. He knew exactly what needed to be done. He also knew no one else was in a position to do it. He saw the ladder operator shake his head, shouting that he couldn't go any higher. Saw a group of firefighters debating whether to attempt interior access. Saw the battalion chief on the ground yelling into his radio for more support, more engines, more anything. They needed time. The mother and child didn't have any. Franklin moved without thinking. He pushed past the line of onlookers. Several shouted at him to stop. A firefighter grabbed his arm. "Sir, you can't go in there!" Franklin didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the building's exterior, the ledges, the window frames, the service ridges, the decorative stone slabs. 10 years ago, he would have mapped his route in seconds. Today, his mind was already reconstructing every possible grip and foothold, every safe angle and every place he risked falling to his death. He slipped free of the firefighter's grip with a surprising strength, and then he was at the base of the building. The heat blasted his face, but he didn't flinch. His old instincts roared back like a storm breaking over a silent sea. His body remembered the movements it had buried away. His fingers brushed warm concrete. The texture told him everything: the temperature, the integrity, the likelihood of crumbling beneath pressure. He took one deep breath. Then he reached upward and gripped the first ledge. He climbed. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Shouts erupted. Warnings, disbelief, pleas for him to come down. A child began crying. A firefighter swore loudly. Someone yelled for the police. But Franklin heard none of it. He heard only the wind whipping smoke around him, the crackling roar of fire eating wood and insulation, the pounding of his own heart as he moved upward, hand over hand, foot over foot, climbing as if the last 5 years had been a pause in motion, not the end of it. His muscles burned almost instantly, age and disuse exacting their tax. But adrenaline filled the gaps, pushing him beyond exhaustion. At the second floor, embers rained down like fiery snowflakes. One landed on his arm, searing his skin. He gritted his teeth and climbed faster. At the fourth floor, a window blew out, showering glass shards onto the street. He pressed against the wall, shielding his face, waiting for the blast wave to pass. Voices below blurred into an indistinct roar. He climbed. By the sixth floor, sweat poured down his face, mixing with soot. His breaths came in tight, wheezing bursts. Each pull felt heavier than the last, but stopping meant death, for him or for the child he was trying to reach. Halfway up, he paused on a narrow ledge, pressed close to the heat-scorched wall. He glanced up at the remaining distance. Still 8 floors. Still so far to go. He closed his eyes. He saw David Mercer, the boy's determined face. The moment before the walkway gave way, the way he'd reached for the unconscious worker instead of saving himself. Guilt surged like a fresh fire inside him, but it did not hollow him this time. It fueled him. It strengthened his grip. "I'm not failing again," he whispered to no one. He pushed off the ledge and resumed the climb. Windows broke one after another as he ascended, each shattering like a reminder of how close he danced to death. Flames rolled within some rooms, lighting them like miniature suns. Smoke drifted out in black waves, stinging his eyes until tears carved clean tracks down his ash-covered cheeks. His hands bled, his legs shook, his lungs screamed, but he didn't stop. And then, finally, he reached the 14th floor. The balcony was near, just an arm's length away. The woman on it gasped when she saw him, unable to process what she was witnessing. A soot-covered stranger climbing the building like some desperate apparition, arriving through smoke and heat like a figure pulled from a nightmare or a miracle. Franklin swung himself over the railing, nearly collapsing as his feet hit the balcony floor. The mother stepped back, clutching her daughter even tighter. Who are you?" she cried, voice breaking. Franklin coughed hard, forcing air into battered lungs. "Someone who can help." The child whimpered, eyes half closed, her breath shallow. No time. None at all. Franklin loosened his burnt shirt, wrapped it around the girl, and tied it with a knot he hadn't used in years. The mother kissed her daughter's forehead as if it were the last time. "Please, save her," she begged. Franklin met her eyes wide with terror and love. and nodded once, solemnly. He lifted the child carefully, securing her against his chest. Then he turned back toward the edge of the balcony and began the descent. As Franklin stepped into the inferno-lit air once more, climbing downward with the child tied to him, the building groaned ominously behind him, foundation cracking, structure weakening, a beast preparing to collapse. How far he would get, he didn't know, but he knew he would not let go. Not this time. And as the flames surged above him and the screams below grew louder, the next chapter of his fate began tightening around him like a noose. Franklin Hayes had always believed there were only two kinds of climbs in life: the ones that took you upward toward triumph and the ones that dragged you down into darkness. But as he hung from the 14th floor of the burning building with a small child strapped against his chest, he found himself facing the rarest climb of all, the descent that could save a life only if he allowed himself to fall into the danger he'd spent years running from. Heat surged against his back like an open oven door. The balcony he had just swung from groaned behind him, metal warping under the assault of fire. He could hear glass inside the apartment exploding in muffled bursts, could feel the trembling of the building as flames chewed through load-bearing walls. The air shimmered with distortion. Smoke curled in thick, disorienting waves. Yet despite the chaos, despite the terror spiraling through the world around him, something inside him steadied, a calmness he had thought long gone. He tightened his grip on the window ledge beneath the balcony and looked down. 13 floors below, the ground seemed impossibly far, a distant mosaic of fire engines, flashing lights, frantic motion, and upturned faces. A sea of emergency workers and civilians watched him with wide, unblinking eyes. Some had hands clasped over their mouths. Others shouted things he couldn't make out. But he didn't need to hear them. He already knew what they were saying. "He's going to fall. He's insane. He can't do this." But there was another possibility, one that Franklin refused to surrender to fear. He can make it. The child stirred against his chest, releasing a small, ragged cough. The sound cut through the roar of the fire more sharply than any scream. It reminded him of the stakes. It reminded him why he was here. It reminded him that failure wasn't an option, because failure had already taken too much from him. He shifted his weight, testing the next handhold. The concrete was hot enough that he could feel the sting through the calluses on his fingers, but not yet hot enough to force him to let go. He hooked the side of his boot into the tiny ridge just beneath the window frame. The angle was awkward, his body half twisted to shield the girl from the heat, but it held. He exhaled once, steadying himself. Then he moved. Every inch he descended felt like pushing through a lifetime of regret. His muscles, weakened by years of disuse, screamed under the strain. His shoulders burned. His forearms quivered. His knees threatened to buckle with every shift of weight. But something deeper carried him. The memory of every life he had saved, and the haunting echo of the one he had not. The building shook again. Not a gentle tremor this time, but a violent shudder that rattled through concrete and steel like the whole structure was taking a tortured breath. Franklin pressed himself flat against the wall, shielding the child with his body. Bits of debris, chunks of charred insulation, splinters of metal, and flakes of scorched paint rained past him. Below, someone screamed, "The wall's coming down! Look out!" But it wasn't the wall that gave way. A balcony 2 floors up buckled and collapsed, flames bursting through the void it left behind. The falling debris missed Franklin by less than 3 feet, smashing against the side of the building with an explosion of sparks and dust. The shockwave knocked him sideways. His boot slipped. For a terrible moment, he dangled by one hand. Wind rushed around him. Smoke stung his watering eyes. His grip threatened to peel open. His entire world reduced to the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears and the desperate whimper of the child tucked against his chest. "No," he growled, not to the fire, not to the building, but to himself. He slammed his free hand against the wall, groping blindly until his fingers found a seam in the concrete. He latched onto it, forcing his body back against the structure. His breath came in ragged bursts. Sweat streamed down his face, mingling with soot and blood. He continued. One ledge, one foothold, one drop at a time. The crowd below held its collective breath. Paramedics positioned themselves directly beneath him with rescue pads. Firefighters scrambled for backup plans. The battalion chief barked orders into the radio, his voice raw with urgency. "He's at 12! He's at 12!" someone shouted. Franklin didn't look down. He couldn't afford to. His entire world was the child he cradled and the next handhold just out of reach. At the 12th floor, the ladder truck extended its metal arm as far as it could go, just inches below Franklin's boots. A firefighter at the top of the ladder reached upward, stretching, shouting, waving for Franklin to lower the child. But the distance was too great. If Franklin tried to lean toward the ladder, he risked losing his grip, losing everything. And the heat at this height was still too brutal for the child to be exposed even briefly. "No good," Franklin rasped. He shook his head at the firefighter. "Too far." The firefighter cursed, slamming a gloved fist against the side of the ladder in frustration. Below the 12th floor, the smoke thinned slightly. Flames still raged through half the building, but the worst of the inferno burned upward, not down. If he could reach the 11th floor intact, he might make it the rest of the way. But the building seemed determined to stop him. A window near his left hand suddenly burst outward, flames roaring through the opening. The blast of heat hit him full force, searing his cheek. He jerked away, instinctively turning his back to protect the child. He lost his foothold again, legs swinging into open air. His fingers dug into the ledge with the desperation of a man clinging to far more than physical survival. His teeth clenched. His entire body shook. "Just hold on," he whispered to the girl. "Just hold on for me, sweetheart. We're going to make it. I swear to you, we're going to make it." Her small hand curled weakly into his shirt. He continued downward. As he descended past the 11th floor, the world around him seemed to slow. His arms felt like they were on fire. His breathing turned shallow, each inhale a battle. His vision blurred around the edges, but he forced himself to focus. 10 floors, 9, 8. On the 8th floor, he finally saw it. An open window, flames licking the edges, but the inside still passable. It was a risk. The room could flash over at any moment. But it was stable enough to let him step inside for precious seconds of recovery. He maneuvered slowly, carefully, swinging one leg into the room. His boot hit solid ground. He let out a breath. He could barely feel his fingers now. His knuckles were raw and bleeding. His shoulders trembled uncontrollably. He slipped fully into the room. Smoke filled the apartment like a choking fog. It swirled around him, wrapping the furniture in darkness. The heat was suffocating but not lethal. Not yet. Franklin crouched on one knee, cradling the child as though she were made of glass. "You're doing so well," he whispered to her, his voice frayed. "Just a little more. Don't give up." For a moment, just a moment, he allowed himself to feel the crushing weight of exhaustion. His arms trembled violently. His lungs burned. Every instinct in him screamed to lie down, to surrender to the exhaustion that threatened to swallow him whole. But that was never an option. He wiped soot from his eyes and looked toward the doorway. Flames danced hungrily just beyond the hall. The structure groaned again, a low, rumbling warning. He had seconds, maybe less, before the room became another tomb. He pushed himself to his feet. He moved to the far side of the room, where a large exterior AC unit jutted out from the wall. Another foothold, another path downward. He reached out, fingers brushing the window frame. The entire building lurched. The floor buckled under his feet. A massive cracking sound tore through the apartment, followed by a deep grinding noise like two tectonic plates colliding. Franklin's heart stopped. The building was starting to collapse. He rushed to the window, ducking just as a section of the ceiling crashed behind him in a hail of sparks and debris. The roar was deafening. Smoke billowed upward. Franklin leaned out the window, took one breath of the comparatively fresh air outside, and climbed out. Below him, firefighters were moving frantically. "He's at 7. Keep eyes on 7. We're losing structural integrity." God, he's actually doing it. He's actually doing it. Franklin hung from the window frame, the child still secured to his chest. Flames flared from the floor above him, curling across the exterior wall like living claws. Sweat poured into his eyes. His fingers slipped. He braced himself. Then he dropped. Not far. A controlled fall onto the next ledge. The impact rattled his entire frame. Pain shot up his knees. He bit back a cry and kept moving. 6 floors. 5. At the 5th floor, another explosion rocked the building, this one from deep inside the structure. A jet of flame erupted from a ruptured gas line. Franklin shielded the girl again, arms tightening until his muscles screamed. 4. 3. He could see faces clearly now. The crowd had surged closer. Paramedics pushed gurneys toward the building. Firefighters held outstretched arms, shouting instructions. 2 floors. The 2nd floor was belching smoke but holding steady. He lowered himself with trembling hands, panting, gasping, vision flickering. His grip faltered once, twice, each time recovered by sheer willpower. Then, 1 floor. Almost home. The ground crew surged forward. Hands reached upward. Firefighters climbed onto the lower ledges, stretching toward him. "Give her to me!" one shouted. Franklin angled the child toward the firefighter. The man grabbed her carefully, cradling her gently as he climbed back down. As soon as she was safe, Franklin's arms gave out. His legs buckled. He slid the remaining distance, 8 feet, before strong hands caught him. His knees hit the ground. His palms hit the pavement. The world spun, blurred, almost drifted into darkness. He felt someone kneel beside him, gripping his shoulder. "Sir! Sir! Can you hear me?" Franklin forced his head up. He blinked through smoke and tears. Paramedics surrounded the little girl. Her mother appeared seconds later, sobbing, collapsing to her knees as she gathered her daughter into her arms. The girl was alive. Alive. Franklin exhaled, a sound that was half sob, half laugh, a release of something that had been trapped inside him for 5 long, unforgiving years. His chest tightened. His body shook. Applause erupted. A sound so overwhelming, so thunderous, he felt it like a wave crashing over him. People shouted his name without knowing who he was. Firefighters stared at him with stunned disbelief. Phones recorded him. Cameras pointed at him. The world saw him, not as a shattered man selling lottery tickets, but as something else entirely. He had saved a life again. He had saved himself. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled. 2 firefighters caught him. One laughed breathlessly. "Who the hell are you?" Franklin swallowed, voice soft and raw. "Nobody," he whispered. But someone in the crowd shouted, "That's Franklin Hayes, from Houston. That's Captain Hayes." Heads turned. Murmurs swelled. Recognition spread like a ripple through water. He didn't deny it. He didn't run from it. He simply breathed. For the first time in years, the world felt light enough to hold without breaking. Paramedics guided him toward a gurney. Lights flashed. Voices blended into a distant echo. Someone draped a blanket over him. Someone else checked his pulse. The last thing he saw before he let his eyes close was the little girl hugging her mother, alive, safe, breathing. When darkness finally claimed him, it wasn't born of guilt. It was peace, But peace never lasted long in Franklin Hayes's life, and as he would soon learn, the world beyond this fire had already begun shifting around him. The world returned to Franklin slowly, as though he were rising through layers of heavy water. Sound came first, a soft, rhythmic beeping that pulsed in the distance like a heartbeat not quite in sync with his own. Then came the sensation of fabric against his skin, the sterile chill of conditioned air brushing his face, and finally, the muted murmur of voices drifting in and out of reach. They felt strangely disconnected, as though he were hearing them through a thick wall. His eyelids fluttered once, twice, heavy with exhaustion. When they finally opened, the world swam into view in a washed-out blur of white ceiling panels and fluorescent lights. Their brightness stabbed at his vision. He blinked slowly, waiting for the glare to settle. A hospital. He had expected as much, though the realization brought no sense of urgency or panic. Instead, he lay still, feeling the weight of the blankets over him, the stiffness in his limbs, the dull ache buried deep inside his muscles like sleeping embers. His throat felt dry, raw, as though he'd inhaled fire. His fingers twitched, involuntarily recalling the sensation of concrete edges, heat-lashed stone, and raw survival. Fragments of memory flooded back. The climb, the child's trembling cough, the roar of flames above, the moment his grip had nearly failed. His body tensed instinctively, and pain rippled through him in sharp streaks before ebbing away. "Easy there," a voice said gently. "You're safe." Franklin turned his head toward the sound. A nurse stood beside his bed, her presence calm and steady, a clipboard in one hand and a reassuring half-smile on her face. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with tired eyes that suggested long hours, but a kindness that softened the exhaustion. "You've been out for a while," she continued, adjusting something near the IV line taped to his arm. "They brought you in last night. Smoke inhalation, extreme fatigue, dehydration, minor burns, and a dislocated shoulder that we set back in place. But you're going to be okay." Franklin tried to speak, but his voice came out as a rasp, barely more than a breath. "The child?" Safe. He needed to hear it. Needed it like a lifeline. The nurse's smile grew warmer. "She's alive, stable, breathing on her own now. Her mother's with her." Franklin let out a long, shuddering breath. Relief washed through him, not the explosive kind that burst from the chest, but the quiet, heavy kind that seeped into his bones and loosened something knotted deep inside. For a moment, he simply closed his eyes. The nurse hesitated, then added softly, "Everyone's been talking about you." His eyes opened again. She gestured to the window. Outside in the corridor, shadows moved back and forth. Journalists, police officers, hospital staff, firefighters. He could hear fragments of conversation, hurried whispers, the sharp click of camera shutters even from behind the partially closed blinds. Someone said his name, Hayes, followed by an incredulous laugh. Another mentioned Houston. Another mentioned the footage. Footage. The climb. Someone had recorded it. Of course they had. In this era, nothing extraordinary happened without becoming 1,000 videos within hours. Franklin looked at the nurse, throat tightening. "I don't..." He paused, struggling for the right words. "I'm no hero." She gave him a look he'd seen before. The kind people offered someone who said something they thought was self-deprecating, not deeply true. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and shook her head slightly. "Well," she said, "that's not what everyone else seems to think." Before Franklin could respond, a sudden burst of commotion flared outside the door. Voices rose. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Someone knocked once, sharply, before the door cracked open. A man in a neat suit pushed his head through, his press badge dangling from a lanyard. "Mr. Hayes? Captain Hayes? Sir? Can we have a moment? Just a few questions." The nurse shot him a glare that could have cut steel. "Out! Now!" But the public wants... I said out. The door shut sharply, leaving a tense silence in its wake. Franklin stared at the ceiling again. He wanted to disappear beneath the blankets. He wanted to erase the cameras and the crowds and the rising storm outside. He had hidden for so long, and now the world had torn open his anonymity in a single, impossible climb. He whispered, They can't be here." The nurse softened. "Don't worry. The hospital security chief's on his way. They're clearing the hall." He nodded faintly, though a part of him knew they could never truly clear it. Not now. A minute later, another voice entered the room, a deeper one, worn by years of shouting over sirens. Franklin turned his head to see a man in firefighter's gear, helmet tucked under his arm. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, with gray threading through his hair and soot still clinging to the creases of his uniform. His expression held both respect and something like shock. "You're Franklin Hayes," the man said quietly, closing the door behind him. Not a question, an acknowledgement. Franklin almost flinched. "Used to be." The man approached slowly, as though approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "Name's Chief Mason. I run the department here." He paused, studying Franklin with a weight in his gaze. "I saw what you did. Hell, my entire crew saw it. I've been in this job for 30 years, Hayes. Seen a lot of things I'll never forget. But what you did yesterday..." He exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't even know how you're alive." Franklin didn't answer. He wasn't sure he knew either. Mason sat in the chair beside the bed. "I also heard about Houston." The words hung in the air like smoke. Thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. Franklin stared at the edge of the blanket, fingers curling around it. "You were one of the best," Mason continued gently. "No one disputes that." Franklin's jaw tightened. He didn't want this conversation, not here, not anywhere. "It doesn't matter," he whispered. "It does," Mason said. "Because whatever happened then, however you've been carrying it, you saved that little girl, and you saved her mother, and maybe saved half my crew by keeping them from making a suicidal interior attempt." Franklin swallowed hard. Mason leaned forward, hands clasped. "They're already calling you the miracle climber, the phantom fireman, the ladderless rescue. News crews are camped outside the building. Your video is everywhere." Franklin felt a cold, sinking dread slide through him. The thing he feared most, visibility, was now unavoidable. "I'm not interested in fame," he said. "I know." Mason gave him a sympathetic look. "But this isn't something you can hide from." Franklin closed his eyes again. How could he explain it? For years he had lived in the shadows because he believed he deserved nothing else. Now the world was dragging him into the light, and it felt like stepping into a fire all over again, one he couldn't climb his way out of. A soft knock broke the moment. The nurse opened the door just a few inches. "Chief, the child's mother is here. She wants to see him." Franklin tensed. I don't..." Mason rose. "You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. But maybe you should see her." Franklin looked down at his hands. The scrapes, the burns, the shaking he hadn't yet managed to control. These hands had taken a life, in a way, and now they had saved one. He nodded slowly. The door opened wider. A woman stepped in, hair tangled, face streaked with dried tears and soot. Her clothes were smoke-stained. Her eyes were red, exhausted, but filled with a gratitude so deep Franklin felt punched in the chest just looking at her. In her arms was the little girl, wrapped in a clean blanket, small fingers curled loosely against her mother's shirt. Franklin inhaled sharply, unprepared for the sight. The woman stepped closer to his bed, then sank to her knees beside him. She didn't speak at first. She simply looked at him. trembling, eyes flooding again. Then she whispered, "Thank you." 2 words, but they carried the weight of her entire world. Franklin opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat closed, his vision blurred. The little girl stirred, opening her eyes just a fraction, looking at him not with fear but curiosity. "She's alive because of you," the mother whispered. "You saved her. You saved us both." Franklin shook his head. I just climbed." "No," she said firmly, voice trembling. "You risked everything. For a stranger." He didn't know how to answer that. She reached out slowly, taking his hand in hers. Her touch was warm, grounding. "You're a good man," she whispered. Franklin felt something break inside him, softly, quietly, like an old wound finally giving way to healing. He lowered his head, unable to hold her gaze. Tears slipped down his cheeks before he could stop them. The woman squeezed his hand once more, then rose, stepping back. "I won't keep you long. You need to rest. But I wanted you to know, we owe you our lives, and we won't forget." As she left the room, Franklin felt a hollow ache rise in his chest. Not pain, but something gentler, something like forgiveness. When she was gone, Chief Mason cleared his throat. "There's something else," he said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "You should see this." He handed it to Franklin. It was a printed image, a still frame from the video. Franklin hanging from the building with one arm, the child pressed to his chest, fire curling above him like a beast ready to devour. His face was half hidden by smoke, but the expression was unmistakable, determination forged in sorrow. The headline above the photo read, "The Man Who Climbed Fire. Who is Franklin Hayes?" Franklin stared at the image for a long time. "I don't want this," he said quietly. "I know," Mason replied, "but it's here, and people want answers." Franklin's grip on the paper tightened. The past threatened to rush back in. David's face, the collapsing mezzanine, the years lost to guilt. But now they came with something else. The memory of a child's tiny cough, a mother's gratitude, the applause he'd tried to ignore. "Maybe," Franklin whispered, surprising even himself. "Maybe it's time I stop hiding." Mason gave him a nod of respect. "Whenever you're ready, Hayes. The world's waiting." Franklin lay back against the pillows, the weight of the past and future pressing down on him in equal measure. For the first time in years, he didn't feel crushed by it. Instead, he felt something close to resolve. But he also knew peace wouldn't last. Cameras were outside. Questions were coming. Old wounds would be reopened. The fire he climbed was only the beginning, and somewhere deep inside, a part of him sensed that the hardest trials were still ahead. As he drifted back toward sleep, the world fading around him, one thought lingered. This time, he wasn't climbing alone. The second morning in the hospital arrived not with sunlight, but with the muted glow of a rising storm. The blinds in Franklin's room rattled softly as wind pressed against the window panes. The sky outside had turned the color of bruised silver, heavy and brooding, as if the world itself braced for something it could not yet name. The storm mirrored the quiet turmoil inside the small room, where Franklin Hayes lay propped against stiff pillows, his left arm resting in a sling, his skin marked by soot shadows he still hadn't fully scrubbed away. He had slept in fits, drifting between dreams and memories so tangled he could no longer separate one from the other. Sometimes he was climbing, his fingers slipping. Sometimes he was in Houston again, hearing the metallic scream of the warehouse beams collapsing. At other moments he saw the little girl, alive, breathing, her eyes opening just long enough to meet his, an image so gentle it stung. The morning quiet was broken by the soft click of the door as the nurse stepped in, carrying a tray with careful hands. Her smile was kind, but her eyes held the tension of someone who had already turned away photographers twice before 8 o'clock. The pressure outside was growing. She didn't have to say it. Franklin could hear it in the rising hum of the hallway. More voices, more footsteps, more phones buzzing like restless insects. "Morning," she said softly, setting the tray on his bedside table. "You should eat a little. You'll get your strength back faster." He nodded, though he wasn't hungry. The idea of chewing felt more exhausting than the climb had been. Still, he forced himself to lift the fork. Something about eating made him feel more human, more grounded, less like a symbol the world was trying to claim. As he took a small bite, the nurse adjusted his IV line and checked his vitals. When she turned back, her expression shifted, closed slightly like someone preparing to deliver unwelcome news. "There's someone here asking to see you." Franklin stiffened. "Journalists? No." She hesitated. "He says he used to work with you, in Houston." The words sliced through him like a sudden blade. He stared at her, breath caught halfway in his chest. For a moment, his mind raced through memories and faces. The old crew, the late-night shifts, the smells of diesel and sweat and burned plastic that clung to every firefighter who lived long enough in the job. "Who?" Franklin whispered. The nurse opened the door just enough to nod at someone in the hallway. A man stepped inside. He was older now, like all of them. The lines around his eyes were deeper, the beard more salt than pepper, but Franklin would have known him anywhere. Tom Alvarez, his lieutenant, his friend. The man who had stood beside him at more fires than he could count, who had argued with him over tactics, who had laughed with him in the quiet hours between emergency calls, who had held him back when Franklin tried to run into the collapsing warehouse that took David Mercer's life. Tom stopped 3 feet from the bed, breath visibly unsteady. He looked Franklin over, taking in the burns, the bandages, the exhaustion carved into every inch of him. "Well, damn," Tom said softly, his voice cracking. "It really is you." Franklin swallowed, throat tight. "Tom." For a long moment, neither moved. They stood suspended in the weight of 5 years of silence, 5 years of unspoken blame, 5 years of wounds that never fully closed. The room felt too small to contain everything between them. Finally, Tom stepped closer and sat in the chair beside the bed. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head bowed. "I saw the video," he said. "The climb. Jesus, Frank. When I saw that fire, I thought I was watching you die again." Franklin exhaled slowly. "I wasn't trying to. I didn't want—" "I know," Tom said gently. "You did what you always did. You ran toward the danger. You saved that kid. You saved her mother. You saved half the damn block." Franklin shook his head. "I wasn't supposed to be there." Tom looked up, eyes sharp. "You weren't supposed to be inside that warehouse either. Doesn't mean you don't belong in a fire." Franklin looked away, staring at the wall. Rain tapped lightly against the window, slow at first, but growing heavier. The storm outside was coming in earnest. Tom took a long breath. "You disappeared. After the funeral. After the board inquiry. After everything." He paused, voice taut. "We tried to find you, Frank. I tried. But you just vanished." Franklin's chest tightened. "I couldn't stay. Everywhere I went, I saw him, heard him. I kept thinking, if I hadn't given that order—" "You did what any captain would have done," Tom cut in. "We all agreed with your call. It cost him his life." Tom's face hardened, grief flickering across it like lightning. "The fire cost him his life. The structure, the collapse, not you." Franklin didn't argue. He'd repeated the guilt so many times in his mind that it had fused into the architecture of his identity. But hearing Tom say it, Hearing the pain in his voice brought something inside Franklin to a slow, trembling halt. Tom continued softly, "You didn't let us help you. You didn't let anyone help you." Franklin met his eyes. "I didn't deserve help." Tom leaned back, exhaling sharply. "You're wrong, and you always were." Silence settled between them. Not heavy now, just fragile. "You saw the girl?" Franklin asked after a long moment. Tom nodded. "I did. She's stable. The doctors think she'll make a full recovery. Her mom's been asking about you non-stop." Franklin nodded, relief drifting through him like warm smoke. Tom studied him quietly before speaking again. "You know the department wants to talk to you." "The one here?" "No, Houston." Franklin froze. Tom went on. "They saw the footage too. They're sending someone. Said they want to help however they can, counseling, support, a formal acknowledgement of what happened back then, and..." He hesitated. "Something else." Franklin frowned. "What's something else?" Tom rubbed his palms against his thighs. "They want to discuss the possibility of reinstatement." Franklin stared at him, stunned. Reinstatement. The words slid through the air like something dangerous, something impossible. His pulse quickened, his mind churned. The thought of donning the uniform again carved through him with a sharp blend of fear and longing. "I can't," he whispered. "I don't deserve..." "Frank." Tom leaned forward. "You climbed a 14-story building with no gear. Bare hands. You saved a life. Hell, you saved two. If that doesn't say who you are, nothing will." Franklin closed his eyes. "I only did what I had to do." "That's the point," Tom said. "That's what makes you you." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in a brief, electric white. Thunder rolled seconds later, deep and trembling. Tom stood, resting a hand on Franklin's shoulder, the same shoulder he had once grabbed to hold him back from running into the collapsing warehouse. "You don't have to decide anything now," Tom said gently. "Just don't run again. Not from us. Not from yourself." Franklin opened his eyes. Something expanded in his chest, like a lung inflating after years of shallow breaths. "I won't," he whispered. Tom nodded, emotion flickering across his face. "Good. I'll be back tomorrow. You rest." He left quietly, closing the door with a soft click. Franklin sank back into the bed, head swimming. The rain pounded harder now, drumming against the windows, washing the city in a muted blur. The storm outside echoed the one inside him, but for the first time, he didn't feel crushed by it. Instead, he felt changed. The door creaked open again, this time very gently. Franklin turned his head, expecting the nurse. Instead, a teenager stood in the doorway, a girl no older than 16, wearing a black hoodie and holding something against her chest. Her eyes were red, as though she had been crying, but her posture was firm. "Are you Franklin Hayes?" she asked softly. Franklin nodded. "Yes." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she had rehearsed every step. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Security doesn't know I came up. I had to see you." Franklin blinked. "Do we know each other?" She shook her head, though tears gathered again. She held out the item she carried, a folded photograph. "My brother," she swallowed. "David Mercer. He died in Houston 5 years ago." Franklin's blood turned to ice. She approached his bed, hands trembling as she held out the photograph. "I needed to look at the man who was with him," she whispered. "The last person to see him alive." Franklin felt the world tilt. He hesitated before reaching out, fingers shaking as he took the photo. It was David, smiling in his turnout gear, helmet under one arm, youthful confidence radiating through the picture. Franklin's vision blurred. "I'm sorry," he said, voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." The girl wiped her eyes. "I didn't come to blame you." Franklin froze. She continued, voice trembling. "My brother, he talked about you all the time. Said you were the bravest man he'd ever met. Said you taught him what it meant to be a firefighter." Franklin's throat tightened painfully. She stepped closer. "I saw the video of you climbing that building." Her voice broke into a sob. "And I realized you didn't abandon him. You never would have. You still haven't." Franklin's heart splintered. She placed her hand over his. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trying to save him, and for saving that little girl. He would have been proud of you." Franklin bowed his head, tears falling freely now. "I failed him." "No," she said firmly. "You didn't." Lightning flashed again, thunder rolling through the sky like a distant roar. She squeezed his hand once, then quietly stepped away. "I just needed to tell you that." Before he could respond, she slipped out the door and vanished into the hallway. Franklin sat motionless for a long time, gripping David's photograph as though it were the only thing keeping him from drifting apart. For the first time in 5 years, he felt the weight of guilt ease, not disappear, but shift, allowing room for something else to grow. Forgiveness. Outside, the storm reached its peak. Inside, Franklin Hayes breathed deeply, letting the air fill him with something unfamiliar. Hope. But hope came with questions, and consequences, and choices he had avoided for years. As he closed his eyes, preparing to face whatever came next, he sensed a change in the air, a subtle shift, a distant footstep, a new storm gathering just beyond the horizon. The storm finally broke by late afternoon, leaving behind the strange hush that only heavy rain can carve out of a city. The world outside Franklin Hayes' hospital window glistened with reflections, wet pavement shimmering like glass, streetlights bending across puddles in trembling ribbons of gold. The sky, washed clean, had softened into the gentle blue-gray of approaching dusk. Everything looked calmer than it had any right to be, as if the violence of the night before had never happened. But inside Franklin's room, quiet did not mean peace. He sat upright now, no longer feeling quite as fragile, though his body bore every reminder of the climb. Burns wrapped in clean bandages, knuckles swollen, muscles aching in ways that felt like echoes of a former life. He had spent the past hour staring at the photograph of David Mercer, the edges smudged with fingerprints. Beside it, on the small bedside table, sat a paper cup of cold coffee, untouched. The events of the morning, the reunion with Tom, the visit from David's sister, still rippled through him like aftershocks. For the first time in years, the memories of that warehouse no longer crushed him with the same merciless weight. They remained painful, yes, but something had shifted. As though the act of saving that child had given him permission to stand under the past rather than drown in it. Forgiveness had not come as a dramatic revelation, but rather as a slow, trembling loosening, an uncoiling of something knotted so tight he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe fully. He was still absorbing that feeling when the door opened again. He expected the nurse, or Tom, or even the mother of the child. But instead, a man walked in wearing a crisp suit and a badge clipped to his belt. He was about Franklin's age, mid-50s, with stern eyes softened at the edges, as if carved by years of work spent telling families impossible news. "Mr. Hayes?" he asked. Franklin nodded. "That's me." The man stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "My name's Daniel Mercer." Franklin froze. Mercer. The name struck him like a sudden blow, hollowing his lungs. He stared at the man now standing a few feet from him, and the resemblance became undeniable. The eyes, the shape of the jaw, the familiar set of the shoulders. David's father. Franklin's mouth went dry. He struggled to speak. "Sir, I didn't realize—" Daniel lifted a hand, stopping him gently. "It's all right." His voice was calm, surprisingly gentle. "I know this is difficult." Franklin looked down, unable to meet the man's gaze. "I shouldn't have... if I'd made a different call that day, your son..." Daniel Mercer stepped forward slowly. "My son was a firefighter, Mr. Hayes. He chose his path long before he ever put on a uniform. He believed in it. He believed in you." Franklin felt his throat constrict. "I led him into that building." "No," Daniel said firmly. "You led him the way captains lead their crew. He followed because he trusted you, and because he wanted to be the kind of man you were." Franklin swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in his eyes. Daniel continued, his voice steady. "For years, I blamed the world, blamed the department, blamed fate. But I never blamed you. Not once." Franklin lifted his gaze, overwhelmed. "Why?" Daniel Mercer breathed out slowly, as though setting down a weight he had carried for too long. "Because I saw the report," he said. "I spoke to every man on your team. They all said the same thing. You tried to go back in. You tried to reach him." Franklin closed his eyes. That memory, the moment he'd lunged toward the flames, the arms pulling him back, the scream ripped from his throat, had scorched him deeper than any fire ever had. Daniel stepped closer to the bed, his expression softening. "Most people spend their whole lives hoping they'll do something good, something meaningful." He paused. "You already did that. And then you did it again. Yesterday." Franklin shook his head slowly. "I'm no hero." Daniel Mercer smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but you're a good man, and that matters more." Franklin felt his composure break, not in a dramatic way, but quietly, like a dam cracking just enough for water to seep through. Tears slipped down his cheeks, unstoppable. Daniel reached out and placed a hand on Franklin's shoulder. "I came here today," he said, "not to talk about the past, but to close it, to let it rest, and to tell you something my son would have told you himself." Franklin looked up, vision blurred. Daniel whispered, "He would have forgiven you." The words struck with a force far gentler and far more devastating than any explosion Franklin had ever faced. They dissolved something heavy inside him, some last remnant of guilt that had clung to him like smoke for 5 long, lonely years. He bowed his head, hands trembling, letting the silence absorb every emotion he could no longer contain. Daniel squeezed his shoulder once more before stepping back. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Hayes," he said softly. "And when you're ready, live again. That's all any of us can do." He walked out quietly, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. Franklin sat for a long time without moving, feeling the slow, profound shift inside him, the way grief had changed shape, becoming not an anchor, but a memory he could carry without drowning. Outside, the storm had passed. In its wake, sunlight broke through the clouds in thin golden beams, illuminating the wet streets like rivers of light. A soft knock came at the door. This time it was Tom again, peeking in with a tentative grin. "Hey," he said. "You okay? They told me Mercer was here." Franklin nodded slowly. "Yeah," he whispered. "I think I'm finally okay." Tom exhaled, visibly relieved. "Good, because, He rubbed the back of his neck. "There's something else." Franklin raised an eyebrow. "Another surprise?" "A good one, I think." Tom stepped inside and closed the door. "The Houston department. They want to honor you at the memorial next month. For David, for the others, for everything you did before and after." Franklin's breath faltered. "I don't know if I—" "You don't have to give them an answer now," Tom said gently. "But they want you there, because you're still one of us." Franklin looked down at his hands, scarred, battered, but his. For years he had believed he didn't deserve to stand beside the people he once called brothers. But now, maybe he didn't need to deserve it. Maybe he simply needed to show up, to let the past breathe, to honor the young man he had failed and the life he had saved. He nodded slowly. "Tell them I'll think about it." Tom smiled. A long silence followed, warm and familiar. Then Franklin asked quietly, "Tom, you think I could ever go back? To the work, to the fires?" Tom studied him for a moment, eyes thoughtful. "I think," he said, "you never really left." Franklin let out a breath that felt like the first clean breath in years. Tom stood, patting his shoulder. "Rest up. When you're out of here, come by the station. My guys would like to shake your hand." After he left, Franklin returned to the window. Outside, a little girl with a pink jacket walked beside her mother, hand in hand. The child looked healthy, laughing even. Franklin recognized her mother's face from the night before. They stopped on the sidewalk across from the hospital entrance. The mother pointed up toward the building, whispering something to her daughter. The girl frowned in confusion, then smiled, waving at the glass windows. She didn't know which window was his. She didn't know he was watching, but Franklin raised his hand anyway. A weight lifted. He knew he would leave this hospital soon, knew he would walk back into the world no longer as a ghost, no longer as a man haunted by a single mistake, but as someone trying, finally trying, to live. He didn't know what came next, whether he would return to firefighting, whether he would work with Tom, whether he would rebuild a life he had once walked away from. But he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't hiding anymore. He reached for the photograph of David, holding it gently. The young man's smile stared back at him, not an accusation, but a memory, a reminder, a promise. Franklin whispered, "I'll do better. I'll live better. I owe you that." He placed the photograph in the drawer beside his bed, not buried, not hidden, just there, ready to be carried with him when he left. The sun dipped lower, casting the room in soft orange light. Franklin lay back, closing his eyes, letting the warmth settle over him like a blanket. For the first time in 5 years, he slept without nightmares. And in that sleep, he dreamed not of fire, not of collapse, not of guilt, but of climbing again. Upward this time, toward something bright, toward a life waiting to be rebuilt.